Hi, Molly. Thanks for joining us for these conversations on machine behavior, where we look to talk about broad concepts related to how we might think about studying emergent AI agents in a way that treats them more as a black box, akin to the way that we think about studying humans as well as animal systems. You have just recently gotten tenure. Congratulations on that.
Thank you.
And you also have recently put out a very fascinating book on censorship. And so as in terms of getting into the conversation, one of the things I was thinking is it would be really interesting to hear more about what you've done with that book, the broad concepts included in that book, and then ways that you think that AI might intersect with some of those concepts that we can dig into further.
Yeah, so I've been studying censorship for maybe a decade, and I particularly with a focus on China. And there's sort of two main questions that I've been really interested in. One is, how does the Chinese government try to manipulate the social media environment? And the second is, what effect does that have on people and their consumption of information? And so for the first question, a lot of what I've done with my co-authors is try to understand what is taken off of the Chinese web, and also try to figure out what is put on the web by the government. And so a lot of this is trying to sort of reverse engineer, in a sense, the government's strategy for manipulating the information environment. Yeah. So we might scrape a whole bunch of different social media posts and then see which go missing. Mm-hmm. And then we're trying to reverse engineer, well, what are the things that the government's trying to take off the web? Or we might try to identify, or what are the posts that are put on by government astroturfers versus the posts that are sort of genuine supportive of the regime, and try to figure out when there's a coordinated effort to sort of flood the information environment. And so those are sort of ways in which we're trying to reverse engineer how the information environment is being manipulated, and I think that speaks a lot to AI.
What did you find in terms of what the government seemed to be oriented towards removing or inserting? What kind of information were they manipulating, basically?
Yeah, so for removing things from the web, we found that the government tends to remove a lot of information about protest events. So one of the main things that tends to be very dangerous for authoritarian regimes are collective action events or uprisings against the government. There are a lot of protests every year in China, and we found that a lot of posts related to those protest events were being removed from the internet. Mm-hmm. We also found that posts being put on the internet by government astroturfers tended to be what we call government cheerleading. So just positive posts that were coordinated during certain events to distract from ongoing events. And so the strategy there was to sort of make it so these social media posts were very, very prevalent, and take away from other things that might be going on.
Sure. The old switcheroo.
Exactly. Yeah.
So how do they do that? Like, do you have any insight into what the actual mechanics look like for them dealing with what are millions and millions of posts and sorting through them and filtering out and then inserting new stuff? What's that mechanism look like?
Yeah. So a lot of this, especially I originally started studying this in 2011, and a lot of this is done by hand. And even now, we think that a lot of astroturfing is also done by hand in China.
And by hand, do you mean that they have like people sitting there?
Yeah, exactly, yes.
How many people do you think?
A lot. So we think that there are thousands of censors hired by social media companies to carry out government directives, and the government itself hires internet police that then make sure that the social media companies are following their directives. So there's sort of many layers of this.
What happens if the social media companies don't follow the directives, or they don't do a good job censoring the government content?
Exactly. So they could be fined or shut down if they don't follow it.
Okay. So there's real consequences for not getting the censorship right.
Definitely.
Do these companies, or does the government use any AI techniques for classification of content to be able to filter? Do you have any evidence that they're employing that sort of technology yet?
So we think that increasingly that is the case, that there are new AI techniques being used. There's certainly so automatic detection of images or is happening. So if you send an image that the government has already flagged for sort of being off, not allowed, then that might not actually get to the person that you try to send it to in certain social media sites. So we do think that there's some automated ways of doing this. Of course, it's difficult because the content of what is off limits changes all the time. So it's sort of difficult to sort of keep up with all of that. But I think it's true in any social media company, actually, when they're trying to remove content, they're trying to move toward more automated methods of doing this. So even Google and Facebook, they are also trying to remove content that's not allowed by their terms of service, like pornography or these types of things.
Yes.
And they're also moving toward automated ways of doing that.
So you've studied censorship primarily in the authoritarian context in China. There are, as I see it, some interesting parallels, though, when you have private social media firms in China having content that they are removing due to government pressure, to some of the similarities between the way that firms that operate in democratic environments, Facebook, Twitter, are removing content that is against their privacy policies or against their code of conduct policies, or frankly, that their user base has indicated that they find unacceptable on the platform, and so there is some squelching of content. I think of the recent Alex Jones example and the InfoWars removal from those platforms. How do you think about private censorship in this context? Just moving from the authoritarian context to even democratic context. What does that look like? How do you feel about that? What do you think when you see Alex Jones removed? Do you say, well, that's generally good, it's reflecting the user base's desires, or does that concern you? What do you feel about that?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question. I think, so mostly what I study is censorship by the government, and that's concerning because if the government is trying to censor something that would hold them accountable, right, then that's creating a problem of the public being able to hold the government accountable. And so we think of that as a real issue. With private companies, of course, they can take off things from their own website. And the idea is that the market or competition between these companies, if they do something that a lot of people don't like, they'll just move to a different company or look at a different website. So that's the idea. The way that I see parallels between, and I talk about this a little bit in the book, is that between authoritarian regimes and between democracies, is that authoritarian regimes are moving toward censorship that is not entirely based on fear, but is based on nudges. So in the book, I talk a lot about how usually when we think of censorship, we think about fear. We think about, you're not allowed to say something. If you do say something, then there will be a certain punishment for it. But increasingly what authoritarian regimes are using is what I think of as like friction or flooding, which is that they're trying to nudge users away from certain material by just making it a little bit more difficult to access. So putting it farther down in the search result, or making a page a little bit slower to load, or kind of blocking pages at certain times but not really telling the user what's happening. Or flooding, which is trying to put more information online in order to distract from other types of events. And these are both things, especially flooding, that we can see anywhere in the world, in any type of country. There are many, many groups around the world that are interested in using coordinated efforts to create fake accounts in social media websites and coordinate a whole bunch of different posts across the internet in order to sort of get to the top of somebody's news feed, right?
Yeah.
And so it's a very interesting concept of flooding is sort of a form of censorship because it's trying to drown out other things, right?
Absolutely.
But in some sense, it's using the open concept of the internet to do just that, right? And so there's this catch-22 sort of involved with this flooding that you see both in authoritarian regimes and in democracies.
Do you also see, though not intentional, friction in the context of these private platforms, even in democracies, where, if I want to get really high quality news content, perhaps I want to go to the Fiscal Times or to the Economist or the New York Times or something like that, and I have 5 articles a month or whatever, and then I'm at their paywall, and so I now have a monetary induced friction where if I want to read content, I've used up my good content, so now I've got some content promoted by trolls or bots or something like that, some lower quality news content.
Definitely. So I think that that friction, whether or not it's imposed by the government or imposed by even natural things, right, is extremely effective with people on the internet, because we're really, really impatient on the internet. If a YouTube video loads just like 3 seconds slower, I'm too impatient. I go to another YouTube video, or I'll go look at another page. There's so much information on the internet that it's really easy to substitute that information. And so we also tend to switch a lot on the internet, right? We tend to kind of go from one app to the other app many, many, many times.
Right.
And so any sort of small delay, and this has been shown in a lot of different studies, has a huge effect on content. And so you can think about this as, a slow web page, or, a search, ordering of search results, what's at the top of your newsfeed. Mm-hmm. All of these things have a big effect on what people are reading. And we, as consumers of information, should be aware of how those things are prioritized for us in order to understand how we should consume them, right? So if the things on top of our newsfeed are prioritized us by a coordinated information campaign, that's probably something we might want to discount more than maybe, something that appears because all of our friends are very interested in it and have really vetted it.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. I wonder, just thinking about the role of algorithms in all of this, is if you introduce some friction and some flooding from outside actors or from paywalls or something like that, and then underlying all of this, you have an algorithm that's basically trying to optimize clicks for profit on the Facebook newsfeed.
Yeah.
Are we at risk in some way of learning dynamics that then become self-reinforcing, because the algorithm learns that actually when you have any friction, it's better to promote articles that don't have any friction associated with them. There's no paywall in this article, so I'm going to promote the lesser quality content. Mm-hmm. And without intervention, would those algorithms be at risk of reinforcing the dynamics that might be problematic? Does that reinforcement sort of concern you? Is that something that you've thought about in terms of the way that the interjection of this information modifies the information environment in perhaps a persistent way?
Yeah, so I think that's one of the really interesting things about friction and flooding, is that not only do they have an initial effect, they also have a secondary effect, which is that they can sort of get picked up by the internet, right? Yeah, so if you have a coordinated information campaign, then all of a sudden, other people are sharing it genuinely, and then this can become something that's sort of viral. And unless you really study how it started, you're not really sure exactly whether or not it was a genuine or a coordinated information campaign. Yeah. Similarly with friction, if you make something very difficult to find, then people won't know about it, and so they won't search for it, and so this doesn't become popular. So it's not, so it feeds back on itself. Yes. And it's very difficult in the end to know how much of it is genuine, how much of it is manufactured. So if you don't really know, in an authoritarian context, for example, if friction is imposed by censorship, and you don't really see a lot of a certain type of information, and you maybe wonder whether it's not that important, or maybe it's just not, it wasn't as big as they say it is in one news article, right? Mm-hmm. And so if you doesn't seem like everybody is sharing it, then maybe you discount it a little bit more and you're less likely to share it. So there is this sort of reinforcing thing about both friction and flooding that algorithms also, I think, contribute to. And then people's interests also, sort of go off of that, right?
So I think there's this dynamic system where people change their interests, the algorithm picks up the change in interest, and you just get this reinforcing positive feedback loop with possibly a negative dynamic.
Exactly, yeah.
Really interesting. Yeah. So one of the things, kind of getting into a little bit of speculation and thinking about the future, that I'm very curious about is what happens when governments, so I think it's the case that governments have been getting better over time at engaging in online censorship. Right. You're the expert in that, you can tell me if I'm wrong. Mm-hmm. But if that is the case, and AI technologies are becoming increasingly effective and increasingly employed, are you worried at all, or are you concerned at all about a future in which governments employ these AI technologies and very sophisticated strategies to modify the information environment in a way that's very difficult to trace at all? So you've traced it so far. Mm-hmm. could they outsmart our capacity to see that they're intervening? And what would that look like?
Yeah, so this is a really interesting question. So I do think it's possible, right, that censorship could be so subtle that it would be very, very difficult to trace. So it would have to be very quick. It would have to be so it would have to be very, very, not very visible, right? And I think that there are certain ways that we're sort of seeing this a little bit now. So if you are censored on some social media platforms in China, you will see that when you're logged into your account, you'll see that your post is up. It just look like nobody will have liked it or shared it. Mm-hmm. But actually that post never was distributed to your friends or was put on your platform, right?
Interesting.
And so it's very difficult for you to even know that you were censored. And your friends obviously don't even know that you shared it. So it's very difficult to figure that out. Yeah. Of course, as long as you know the person who originally posted the content and you can then check and see whether or not the content was up, then you can go and detect censorship. But I think that there is a move toward making censorship less visible, and the government is invested for the most part in making censorship less visible, so that because people don't typically like being censored, right? And so there's this move toward making it a lot more undercover. And I think algorithms, in part, can facilitate that. So I think there are ways that algorithms can be used, to against censorship, and then there are ways that algorithms can be used for the purposes of censorship.
Sure. Yeah. So one of the things that relates to that has kind of weirded me out recently is, I don't know if you use Gmail or not, but I use Gmail, Google Mail client, and it has recently rolled out an autocomplete feature in which I start typing about a topic, or I start typing a sentence, and then I can tab to complete the sentence because Gmail has read, terabytes and terabytes of email text and knows what probably should go next in this sentence.
Right.
And that got me thinking, as it relates to censorship and as it relates to the modification of the information environment. If you're the government and you have control over a social media platform and you can get them to do your will, if you're an authoritarian government, can you start to modify what a sentence should look like or what content should look like before the person even posts it, in a way that is a slight modification of what they were going to say, but is just enough of a nudge that it's close enough conceptually to what they were going to say that they're okay with posting it because it reduces the friction associated with posting?
Yeah.
So that you don't actually have to censor what they said, you can censor what they were going to say in like this subtle way. Have you thought about that at all? And does that concern you? What do you think about that in the future?
Yeah. So these sort of autocomplete or guessing what you're going to say can be extremely useful, right? From a consumer, I will use this and save time or whatever. Right. And the question is who controls this and whether or not it's useful to you to live your life and do the things that you want to do, or if it's somebody, who's sort of controlling what you're trying to say, right? And I think that this certainly, we see sort of very preliminary things of this online in some authoritarian regimes. So, for example, if you post something, and sometimes it can be keyword flagged, so there might be a word in it that the social media company will decide that you can't post that with that word. And so you're not allowed to post it with the word. And so often what people do in these sorts of regimes is then they post it with a word that looks very similar, but it's not. It's like the
NLP.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So it's not exactly the word. The problem with that, though, and people say, they thwarted censorship by sort of getting around this by posting a different word. But the problem with that is that everybody sort of comes up with a different word to use to substitute for the censored word. Yeah. So if you're searching for that topic,
right,
even if you know one of the words, you're only going to get a subsection of the post. So the coordination that we use with language to be able to decide and find that information is sort of thwarted by this very simple keyword censorship. So you can imagine if this became more sophisticated that it could, have an impact.
Yeah. So a couple of thoughts there. One is that it reminds me a lot of the Timur Kuran article where you go out and protest if you can see that enough other people are going to go out and protest, that there's some coordination, and that coordination could be undermined just simply by the fact that if I used an A instead of an E for this modified word, you can't find it. And so you can't actually see the number of people that are really pissed off at the government for this particular topic. And so you sit there in the ether and think, oh, I guess no one else cares. That's very interesting.
Exactly, yeah.
And then the other thing is just, I'm still hung up on this Gmail autocomplete thing, probably because it's saving me time and making me worried about the future. But if you know that the autocomplete is not being run by Gmail in kind of this neutral, efficiency-oriented manner, but instead it's being run by the government. And so the government says, did you mean to say, ? Does that induce a kind of self-censorship that you talked about in your book that is a more active inducement of self-censorship? So, right, if you wrote something previously and it got censored and you infer that the government censored your content, maybe you don't say that again in the future. But maybe you never say it at all because you realize that the government subtly doesn't want you to say that sort of thing.
That's interesting. Yeah. So that would depend on, whether or not you believed that there was a punishment and what that and the probability you thought that the punishment would actually happen, right? Yeah. So one of the problems with governments imposing sort of fear on the internet is there are lots and lots of people who use the internet, and so it's very difficult for them to enforce that type of fear, right, with everyone. Yeah. And so a lot of times, because fear has to be observable in order to work, so in order for you to self-censor, you have to know there's a punishment and you have to know what you're not supposed to say. So maybe this technology you're describing would facilitate that. But because it has to be observable, it has these sort of negative side effects, which is it could cause backlash. So if you know that this is off limits, then you might be angry that this is censored. It can also draw you to that information. Why doesn't the government want me to say this? This is very interesting. Maybe I need to go. Maybe I need to go search more information. Yes. Right. And if it works too well, it can create these problems with sort of. The government doesn't know what you're worried about, and so then they can't fix the things that you get these sort of unexpected protests, right? Yeah, and so fear is a little bit dangerous, I think, for authoritarian regimes to use, and I think that's why we see them moving a little bit more toward these sort of invisible forms of friction and flooding, where it's very difficult to tell whether or not this is the company or a technological issue or the government or there's this sort of nebulousness of censorship. Yeah, you can hide it from even the individuals that are being censored, and you can hide it from the masses that the censorship is involved. So along that, are there any ways that you think that AI could be used for good, sort of to counteract or fight against that censorship, or to help the oppressive regime opponents fight back? Yeah. So I think there are a lot of, AI is going to transform our lives. There are a lot of ways in which AI can be very useful in our lives, but in particular on spreading information or counteracting censorship, one example that I'm really optimistic about is machine translation. So if you think about differences in languages are a natural form of friction. They're something that makes it very difficult to get around and share or read that information because of the other language. And for example, authoritarian regimes like the Chinese government won't block a version of an English page that they have blocked in Chinese because not a lot of people are going to be willing to spend the time to read the English version. Yeah. But if you have an app on your phone that allows you to sort of get the in your own native language the information from abroad, I think this could be a way that information can be better disseminated around the world, not only from English to Chinese, but also from Chinese to English and sort of generally. So, and that's just one example. I think there are other ways that AI is going to reduce friction, and there's some really exciting ways in which AI can make our lives better and give us more information and put the right things at the top of our newsfeed that is good. The other answer to the question is I think it's really important, and I think this is what this article is really getting at, to understand what these algorithms are doing in order for the public to sort of hold them accountable. So as governments around the world, not just authoritarian regimes, but even the most well-meaning governments start using AI to assist with governing, and there are a lot of reasons why that could be a good thing, the public needs to understand how these are working in order to, participate in government, right? In order to hold the government accountable.
Yeah.
And I think there are a lot of times, as you were mentioning before, where we maybe design a certain algorithm, but the actual result is not necessarily what we intended it to be because of the training data or whatever it is that we put into it, right? And so I think that there is this need to, in some sense, use AI itself to study AI, or just to study AI on its own, and explain it and try to make it understandable in order for the public to be able to continue to function as a democracy, right? Or to function. I mean, even we're thinking about 10, 20, 30 years down the road, right? This is this will be more pressing, I would say.
So what I heard from you there is that machine behavior is very useful to the continuance of democracy around the world. That's excellent. That's
I think so,
yeah. So you can use the tools that we have as social scientists and as behavioral scientists to kind of interrogate some of these systems and see what they actually do.
Right.
Let's say we've done that. You and I are political scientists. How do you think about regulating these systems? Given that the systems themselves are, as we know, so dynamic and they rapidly change, and the government, or say Facebook's newsfeed algorithm, it's one thing today, it learns based on the training set today, it's another thing tomorrow in terms of its output. How does the regulation environment that we have, which is built for an era that is much slower and that things stay the same for much longer, deal with AI? How do we regulate AI?
Oh, that's a really hard question. I'm not sure I have the answer.
Well, I don't think I do either.
I think there are a few things to take into account. So one is, I think it's important that the public understands what algorithms are doing in order to understand how to consume media, right? So I think we've seen a big shift even in the last few years about how the public understands how media is prioritized to them and what types of media to trust and what not to trust. And I think those are very important sort of lessons for everyone, including myself, including everybody, right?
Yes.
To understand what we're reading and who's sort of why we're reading it, right? So, and I think that's a function of researchers who are trying to understand how certain information kind of filters to the top of our attention, but it's also the function of the media to disseminate that information. And then I think people start, at least the optimist in me tells me that people start discounting certain types of media and trusting others. But of course, we still as social scientists have a lot to learn about how or if that happens, and trying to understand how people understand how people understand algorithms, right? So this is even a deeper level of understanding machine behavior, is when we do talk about how machines behave, how does the public understand
what that even means.
What that means,
yeah, that's incredibly difficult. We are not anywhere close yet. And the thing so I perhaps I like to say realist, but maybe even more pessimistic about the advent of these technologies, largely because I think that we are not nimble enough in the social sciences, in generally regulation. So, I mean, social sciences are not engaged in regulation, but sometimes we inform policy via the research that we do.
Yeah.
And that lead cycle is 5 years at some of the fastest in terms of us doing research to it making it into some form of policy. 5 years from now, AI is going to look very different than what it looks like right now. So I'm a little bit pessimistic about that. But
I think that's a fair perspective to take.
You said something very interesting, or a number of things very interesting over the course of this conversation that I wanted to get back to. One of which we were talking about the way that private platforms might censor certain content, and in an ideal marketplace, the people that are censored from that platform could potentially just go over and use another platform. And you also talked about the ability for machine translation to enable ease of access to information for people in authoritarian regimes. In both those settings, I see that dynamic as producing a risk of polarization. So in the private context, now you have, so we talk about the risk of polarization on Facebook, but you make that in the extreme when you actually say, for example, in a hypothetical, Facebook really becomes very intolerant of conservative speech broadly. And so it doesn't want to see much of that speech on its platform, and another platform rises up and says, this is the conservative Facebook, this is the liberal Facebook. And now we have somewhat institutionalized that polarization. So I see that as somewhat of a risk. And then I also see somewhat of a risk of who is able to access outside information that they're able to use Google Translate on in authoritarian regimes like China are those, I think, that can afford VPNs and get that kind of outside access. Now, maybe that spills over to other people who can't afford VPNs, but maybe it doesn't. And are you worried about the degree to which censorship and the use of these AI technologies for the identification of content and even the, basically the structure of these institutions producing further polarization of the information environment in the future? Or do you see that, are you worried that it further polarizes, or do you see opportunities for it to become less polarized? And if so, what are those opportunities?
Yeah, so I definitely think that censorship, or one of the things I've written a little bit about is how censorship sort of exacerbates what we think of as the digital divide. Yeah. So the digital divide is this idea that people with less resources have less access to the internet, and therefore, people with more resources have more access to the internet, and information is really important for your future opportunities. And so this is a divide that we see. So censorship exacerbates this, and I'll give you an example because you sort of alluded to it of the Great Firewall of China. So the Great Firewall blocks foreign websites, or some foreign websites, for example, Twitter, Facebook, Google, the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, et cetera, from Chinese IP addresses. So in order to access those types of information, users have to download a VPN or a proxy, and then they can get around the firewall by sort of logging into another computer outside of, and then they can get access to that. But that costs a little bit of money, it costs a little bit of time. And so the people who tend to use those, which is a very small proportion of the Chinese population, are people who have money, have education, have been abroad, work for a foreign enterprise. And so the community that's across the wall is separated in this polarization sense from the community that is not across the wall. And there are a lot of people who don't even know what the wall is, right?
Yes.
So that's very difficult to jump the wall if you don't even know what it is, right?
Right.
So there's these separate communities. So I think that there are ways in which censorship are sort of, because a lot of censorship is porous and you can get around it. The people who do end up getting around it are better equipped than the people who do not, and that exacerbates the way, their resources that they have available to them.
Yeah.
I think that this is true for a lot of what we see in AI, because the understanding of what's going on is, you're sort of, more education is required to understand it, and therefore more educated people are more equipped to handle it. I actually see machine translation as an exception to that, because if you are more educated, you're better able to read the English news.
Sure.
But if you can get that machine translated automatically through some app on your phone, for example, then that is a way in which that information can be available to you, even if you can't read English or you can't read French or whatever it is, whatever that you're interested in looking at. Yeah. So I think that machine translation is one example of a way that it was sort of breaking down barriers that cause friction.
Interesting. Yeah. So one of the things that I'm kind of going to ask a little bit of a speculative question that is a big, broad question that I don't have any concrete answers to, and I'm not sure that there are any good, real answers to it. It's speculative. So one of the things, though, that concerned me and has concerned me for a while is the degree to which we have just sort of, as a society, opted into the acceptance of very mass surveillance of basically everything that we do. we're now collecting data on pretty much everything that we do. If you have a Fitbit, we know where you were, how much you walked. If you have your phone, we know the same information. Basically, we know what you read, we know what you said, we know who you talked to. We're basically collecting all the information, and governments around the world are getting as much of this information as they can. And originally, I remember a number of conversations with friends and family where it's like, oh, they have all this data, but like, what can they even do with it? No one can look at all of that data. But now we have technologies that actually can start to parse more efficiently those masses of data in ways that can provide useful information to governments, especially those governments that want to be oppressive, but even liberal democracies as well. I'm kind of pessimistic about what that looks like for our future, generally because I've observed a trend towards less liberal democracy around the world, and also even in this country, a trend towards much greater power for the executive with less oversight of the other branches of the executive power, basically since 2001. How do you feel about that? Do you think that total surveillance or near total surveillance is something that keeps you feeling pessimistic when coupled with AI technologies? Do you feel that it is something that can be counteracted via normal kind of democratic means? Are you more optimistic than I am? Are we in the world of 1984, or are we not? So as I said,
so I think that this is a really interesting and difficult question, obviously, to answer. But I think one thing that this type of surveillance does is increase the power of all forms of censorship that I talked about before.
Sure.
So certainly it increases the power of fear. So if you can be targeted, if the government knows everything you are doing, then they can more, there's no way to really hide your actions. Yeah. But it also, interestingly, increases the power of friction and flooding, because if somebody wants to target you in a way that nudges you in a particular direction and they have all of your data to understand you, you become very easily manipulated, right? Yeah. And so as much as I think there's a lot of optimism with AI, there's a lot of ways that AI can be used for good, for improving governance, for having a more responsive government, responding to the needs of people. It also dangerously increases the power of governments. And if there's a government that we don't, is not acting in our interest, which a lot of governments do if we can't hold them accountable, then I think that can be a big problem. So I think that there are moments of optimism and pessimism.
Okay. Fair. Yes. Very interesting response to that. It's a tough question for sure.
It's a tough question.
Yeah. Obviously, there are things that could intervene. One of the things that you could hope for is that there is much more democratic involvement, and people say, look, it's okay to have our data because our data exists. We've opted into a world in which our data exists, and we're being measured all the time, but it's not okay for the government to have that data, or it's not okay for the government to be able to use it for this or that. The European GDPR is, I think, a positive example of saying, okay, we're going to try and reduce the degree to which these firms are able to collect everything, and by reducing the firm's collection of it, you also probably reduce the government collection of it.
But the big question of whether or not this is good for democracy, I'm not sure.
Well, I mean, if you think self-censorship is not just about what you write, but it's also about everything that you do. So, for example, if it's clear that I have a network tie because I went to the same place with some regime activist or somebody that even liberal democracies don't necessarily like, then I might choose to behave differently, not just talk differently in my daily life, so as to not reveal that network information.
So I think surveillance does increase the fear aspect of censorship. So surveillance allows governments to sort of pinprick exactly who is even searching for or considering writing about something that they don't want. But it makes censorship a lot more visible also. So there's this sort of interesting trade-off.
Strategic trade-off.
Yeah, I think this is a question of whether or not we are entering in a sort of Brave New World scenario or a 1984 scenario, right? Are we
Yes,
aware of the censorship that's happening to us, or are we sort of nudged along in a way that we're not really completely aware of?
I don't know the answer to that either. I don't think either of those books were particularly positive.
No, I think that's true. I mean, in an authoritarian context, I think in a democracy it's harder. I just don't have enough, I guess, scientific background to understand. I mean, I don't study this.
I think even the people who do don't have
answers.
They're not seers and sages. They don't. Let's put it this way: our profession didn't do a good job even predicting the dynamics that led to the rise of Donald Trump. So I think that what the political environment looks like 20 years down the road, all of us are very cautious about saying anything about that.
I think that's true.
Well, thank you for joining me today for this very interesting conversation.
Thanks for
we
having
talked
me.
about all kinds of ways that AI can interact with censorship and government power, and ultimately why it's really important to study machine behavior for informing policies that could be used to regulate these technologies and things like that. So thanks again, Molly.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you for having me.